Good day today. Today is Labor Day, and as we all know, Labor Day sort of designates the end of summer. And so I want to do something slightly different today. Rather than talking about a particular topic or a particular part of the world or country, I want to sort of broadly talk about what is at issue nowadays. And then next time I'll get back to more specifics. So let me start by running down some things. The German Chancellor Scholz, who is not a very exciting figure and looks like he's not a particularly good Chancellor of Germany at the moment, nevertheless has coined a term which has now become sort of almost universal. Everybody's using it. And in German, it is called Zeitwende. In English, the equivalent might be New Era, but Zeitwende, Zeit meaning time, is sort of more broad and philosophic and vague. And Wendel is it's not exactly era. It's a little bit like you've turned a page and you don't really know exactly what's on the new page, but you know the page has been turned. And so I've noticed that various leaders in Europe and so forth are now using the term. Sometimes these terms evolve uh, and become fairly universalized because there's no easy equivalent in a given language, and somehow somebody has coined a term or a phrase. And of course, what he means is that the times have changed. You know, you could say in, I don't know, the Beatles song, right? The times they are changing. But every now and then, of course, times always change incrementally. And we talk about this set of events and that set of events. But every now and then, somebody sort of sits back in their chair and says, we really are in a new time, a new era. But we don't even exactly know what that is. We don't really understand all the component parts. All we really know is that things have fundamentally changed. And how fundamental and with what implications and what to do about it is often not very clear as one moves step by step into this Zeitwende. Uh, so let me start by going back to climate change. I mean, we've been talking about climate change now for years. There are arguments about it, there are policies about it. Lots of people don't believe in it. Lots of people who may believe in it, for example, corporations, might decide not to do anything about it. There's a lot of hand wringing. And sometimes local action is taken, but local action is impacted by action further downstream, quite literally and figuratively, right? You might want to save water, but on the other hand, if the rivers dry up, are already dry, you know, saving water becomes academic. You just don't have any. And so we are in this sort of vague, philosophic, and practical situation in terms of climate change. By now, you know, everybody agrees there is climate change. Everybody agrees that there need to be policies. One is talking about what needs to happen by, 2030 or 2035 or 2040. You know, the state of California has laid out rules as to when petroleum run cars have to go away, no new purchases, and so forth. So there's a lot of talk, there's some policies, and there's a lot of hand wringing. But there are also sort of these vague sense of exactly where are we going with all of this. And many people understand that there's climate change. We're right here in a heat wave. Death Valley had a temperature of 124 the other day. I think that was the second highest recorded temperature in the US for sure. And we sort of look at this all to some extent as curiosities. For example, when the temperature went that high in Death Valley, apparently tourists went there because they wanted to experience what it felt like to be in such a hot climate. So we're both serious and unserious about this. But in the last year, and I would say even in the last few months, uh, the seriousness and the urgency has become not just philosophic and not just on the part of those who are concerned about climate change as a matter of occupation or ideology, but in terms of reality. And I would say that the sort of the new era in thinking in the last few weeks has been ushered in part by what's happened in Pakistan. You probably have heard on the news that 33 million people in Pakistan are now homeless, have lost their incomes, are getting malnourished. This is really, in some ways, the largest group of people who've been quickly impacted by the consequence of climate change. If one wants to think about this in terms of proportion, think California. I mean, the number of people impacted by the floods in Pakistan are roughly equivalent to the whole population of California. Just imagine the entire population, the entire state of California going underwater simultaneously within a few hours, a few days, right? So the magnitude of some of this is finally sort of sinking in part because of catastrophic events that are beginning to happen, and especially that have happened in the last year. So that the incremental, we need to do something about climate change, but after all, Congress can't really vote for it because too many senators or congressmen are being paid by the coal industry, and on and on and on. These kinds of debates, these kind of incrementalisms, have on the one hand, at the micro level, and at the macro level, in terms of philosophic arguments of scientists, have, I think, sort of begin to merge in the middle. That people are beginning to understand, both in the United States because of not enough rain in some parts of the country, on drought, and in other parts of the country, torrential rains and overflowing rivers, and even sort of people who don't pay a lot of attention to the news, the sort of kind of events that have happened in Pakistan are beginning to come home. Now, this is to some extent consciousness raising. What is politically going to happen as a consequence of this consciousness raising is unclear, and it seems to me we'll see in the next year to what extent these major events that capture the attention of the whole world and which reflect that the world collectively and individually has to think about it very differently. In other words, a page has been turned with respect to climate. Whether this is really true or whether this is really a blip and climate change will get worse and worse, and we will continue to miss the opportunities to rescue people, countries, continents, etc. So it seems to me both sort of existentially, which it used to be considered in part, and practically are merging at some levels, and we are now thinking about it, or the world is beginning to think about it differently. So that's sort of one kind of issue to look at. Another kind of issue to look at is that, we know that the most of the Earth's surface is in fact oceans, right? We sort of know that. We sort of hear about oceans polluting. We sort of hear about conflicts in oceans here, there, and yonder, whether it's Taiwan and China and so forth. But again, we've had sort of something resembling an incremental view. Environmentalists have been, warning, not just warning in terms of this large chunk of the world needs to be carefully husbanded and attended to, but also having warned about, uh, the equivalent of whole islands of plastic flowing in the Pacific Ocean and so forth. But that's sort of, you're sitting in Santa Cruz, and if you're not an environmentalist, you might not even read the article. And then, there's recycling, and you figure if you put your plastic bottles into bags, it'll probably be okay. You're doing your bit. But now things are getting more serious, and they're getting more serious in a number of ways. One, the oceans are said to be rising from 10 to 12 feet in the years to come. And they're not that far away. The ice melt, both in Antarctica and, for that matter, in Greenland, is serious and happening before people's eyes. This is not just a National Geographic PBS issue anymore. This is an issue that is now all of a sudden escalated into seriousness. And very often in world affairs, things get serious, not just because of arms and weapons and bombs, but also because of their economic impact. So let me take a couple of minutes to talk about oceans, our inheritance. The ice melt in Greenland has underneath it soil. That's different than Antarctica or large chunks of Antarctica. And the soil is sand. And as it happens, the sand that is underneath the ice in Greenland is suitable for making concrete. Now, that seems very esoteric issue, but it really isn't, because there is a global concrete shortage, which means building buildings with concrete has become very expensive and often not even accessible, which is why in some Gulf states and even in New York, they're trying to build buildings, even skyscrapers, out of processed wood, because concrete seems to be a resource which is very expensive and in short supply. And you say, well, isn't there sand everywhere in the Sahara and so forth? Well, there is, only it's not suitable for making concrete. So it happens to be that the Greenland sand underneath the ice in Greenland, which is melting and raising the ocean level, also is useful for concrete, which means that those who are interested in concrete are actually sort of interested in the ice melting sooner rather than later, so they can get their hands on. So there is now a kind of a political dynamic. On the one hand, many of us are freaked out about the oceans rising and what this means in terms of destruction of the shorelines of countries and livelihoods and all the rest of it. East Coast, West Coast, other parts of the world, islands entirely going away. And there are others that have an economic interest in some of this for some reason, in this case, sand that's useful for concrete making, who are pushing in the opposite direction. So here we are with another issue that used to be sort of vaguely existential for most of us, right? Ice is melting, the seas will rise, this is not a good thing, Westcliff may go away, but probably not in our lifetime, we think, and so forth. But now that the ice is melting much more quickly than anybody anticipates, it is not only part of climate change, but has become not just an existential or scientific issue, but a page has turned, and we all are beginning to have to think about it in very different ways with much more urgency. So here we have sort of two almost linked issues, which in the last year have become very different. And this summer in particular, articles have been written, not just environmentalists, but others have called attention to the fact, what do we all do in the world? When in fact the sea raises itself, whole islands in Indonesia will go away, whole countries will go away, and what is being done about it, other than a fair amount of talk, a little bit of policy here and there, but as I said, it's been perceived both America in general and in many parts of the world as a little sort of existential issue and not a here and now issue. And I'm proposing that all the issues surrounding these two things, climate change in the aggregate, but also sub aspects of climate change, melting ice and so forth, have huge environmental consequences, but also have huge economic consequences. So then one talks about, let's say, I'm just rattling off on different issues. One is talking about how economies of countries are changing. There are now big debates in the United States and elsewhere. We should be less interdependent, globalization, which meant different countries specialized in different things. Was maybe a bad idea because look, if you have, a COVID outbreak or you have a conflict or a war, then you can't access the chips that you might have to, or the technology that you might have to access from China or Taiwan or South Korea. So maybe, and the Biden administration is talking about this, you need to bring some of these industries back to on the national shores of countries because, after all, interdependence has gone too far. So now there's a very broad gauge political issue on the part of industrial countries, but even late industrializing countries, about how much autonomy economies need to have in order to protect themselves, both against political conflicts, economic conflicts, and environmental conflicts so they can protect their population. Now, this is easier said than done in very large countries and affluent countries, which might have the capacity to produce some of the things that they used to import. But for many little countries, which have neither the technological wherewithal or the economic wherewithal to do that, this is a recipe either for putting them in worse situations than they even imagine, or trying to have to think entirely in a new way about how it is that everybody in the world has access to the cell phones they need, the technology they need. The car manufacturers have the capacity to have all their parts available to them and so forth. I don't want to belabor this point because I'm sure you have read and thought about this, but this is an issue of a different, both philosophic and practical magnitude, which also means that the German chancellor had a point by saying, we're in a new era. The structure of the new era, the policies of the new era, the disposition of the populations in countries in this new era are by no means sorted out. We have turned a page, whether we realize it or not. And what to do with what's on the new page is by no means clear, either economically, politically, or socially in any particular country in the world, I would say. Some countries are doing better with respect to this than others. It is also the case that new resources are needed in new places. And while I'm talking about oceans, let me quickly say that you may or may not recall, and I talked about before, and I may talk about again, the law of the sea, which is a very complex treaty which gives rights for 12 miles as part of your territory. Then there's an economic zone that you have some control over. And eventually there is the high sea, which is meant to be managed by an international institution, which was promulgated by the treaty, which finally came into being in 1994, though they started negotiating it in the 1950s and 60s and 70s, etc. But in any event, there is a seabed authority which manages and is supposed to manage any kind of economic issues that are underneath the water that emerge. Now, up until now, this has been mainly pie in the sky. But it now turns out that many of the metals that are necessary for our contemporary technology, copper, nickel, and so forth, are not just in the soil of various countries, for example, the Congo and other countries, and are mined from land, but are actually found in the deep sea, in the ocean, at the ocean bottom. And we have, in modern times, the capacity to get down there and do the mining. So, as it turns out, about 1,500 miles into the Pacific from the shores of the West Coast, there will be industrial mining not too far down the road, which will be managed by the Seabed Authority, and which is not yet, but will be a main source of the various metals that are now, and that we are now dependent on from, as I say, Congo, for example, Indonesia, nickel, and other places. So there is a new world of getting natural resources from the ocean, which is also developing, and which, fortunately or unfortunately, is part of an international treaty which most countries in the world signed in the 90s. And therefore, it might be possible to mine this in such a way that them who need these metals can have them, but also some of the benefits go into general coffers to help other countries get access and so forth. So there's a whole new world of deep sea mining that will probably emerge within the next decade and is probably starting in the Pacific in the not too distant future. Ironically, and I've talked about this before, many international treaties, whether it's the Law of the Sea or whether it's the Landmine Treaty or lots of the Treaty for the Rights of the Child and so forth, are subjects that have international treaties, which means countries are bound to adhere to them. And many countries have signed on to them, but the US has not, typically. It has not signed the Law of the Sea, it has not signed the Rights of the Child, it has not signed all kinds of things. The reason being that when in the US political system, you don't just sign a treaty, US in fact has signed it, but then it has to be ratified by Congress. And Congress typically doesn't want to ratify things, especially people to the right of center, because they say it encroaches on our sovereignty. So we're unwilling, for example, to give authority to an international organization which is supposed to manage things on behalf of all states, by us just saying, no, we can't do this because it's giving up part of our sovereignty. So this is an interesting constitutional issue, and if it went to the Supreme Court right now, you better believe that the Supreme Court majority would rule, no way should we be part of these treaties and give up a little bit of our sovereignty to them. It should be added that even though we haven't signed most of the treaty, very often we more or less adhere to them as a means of policy. But that raises other interesting questions, which has to do with what is happening in various parts of the world domestically. And domestically, as you have more and more authoritarian leaders, as you have more and more leaders coming both from the right and the left, the arguments against doing things universally or internationally are really undermined by many countries. And that the magnitude of that is also new or newish, I should say. I think that part of we are living in a new era is the fact that we are living in a new political era as well. Populations are in various degrees suffering or feel insecure given the contemporary world. and therefore authoritarian leaders of the right and the left, be it Trump, be it Orban, be it of the left, the Mexico, India, whatever, even people who are democratically elected, tend to get fairly authoritarian these days. And a very large chunk of the population supports that. And we can speculate, and we could all collectively think about, why is that? Why are people so attracted in this era increasingly, and therefore it's part of the having turned the page, to individuals who claim, A, that they're going to protect them against foreigners, be they immigrants, being trade partners overseas, being whoever. Why are people being so scared of that? Why do most people think their governments are really not controlling the right things in their society? And often making very bad decisions, right? We have a lot of violence, so rather than addressing how that violence comes about, it's attractive to say people need to have guns, and the guns have to be better because that will protect us. That's a kind of an American phenomenon. For those of you, by the way, who are interested in gun policy, there was a rather good, on Sunday, Fareed Zakarian program, which compared US policies and attitudes to countries like Australia, like Switzerland, which have a lot of guns but don't have the number of gun deaths. And of course, most societies have about the same number of mentally ill people. So even there, in a sense, we have a situation where the new era, so to speak, and the uncertainty of the economics and the environment and natural resources and all the rest, and the violence in the case of the United States, all of these things making people nervous. And when people are nervous, people who claim to have the answers, even if they're, by somebody's standard, cuckoo answers or the wrong answers or moving almost into fascist answers, have become popular. So I guess what I've wanted to address today is to say that there are cumulatively, you reach a point where there are enough changes where in fact the page is turned. You now have a new situation. And that is true in many eras of life nowadays, whether it's the economy, whether it's the environment, whether it's the aging population and immigration and so forth, whether it's the kind of warfare that is currently going on, or whatever, not just in the Ukraine, but in other places, which I'll talk about some more some other time. All of these things have gotten to the point cumulatively, bits by bit over the years, so that if you look at the world right now, you can see that you've had enough of a change to have what Chancellor Scholz says, a new time frame, a new era, so to speak. And what that era will bring, what policymakers will make out of it, what the populations in various countries will respond to, is far from clear. And so I leave you on this Labor Day by saying the world is in a real mess. We all realize the US is, and the world in general. But what's interesting is to recognize that it's not just, more of the same but badly, but rather that we need to think both in terms of philosophical issues, in terms of policy issues, in terms of where we as individuals stand on various things, as living in a sense in a new era. And for those of us, who are not spring chickens in the plural, it is interesting to contemplate that towards the end of a life, the world really has moved into a new era. It's useful to try to understand that and not just say, well, I don't want any part of it, because of course we're still citizens and actors, and we can still have some influence on political influence, but also influence on family members and so forth. that the newness of it all shouldn't be pretended it doesn't exist on the one hand, and on the other, that maybe some new thinking is really urgently needed at all levels of this enterprise. Okay, well, thank you for joining me. And as I said, I'll get back to more specifics in 2 weeks. Bye.